What are the Twitter files and why are they so important? Hi, my name's Tony Bersunas. Welcome back to Red, White, and Blind, where the purpose of this show, if you're new here, is to break the spell of the corporate media and to discern the story behind the story. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about the Twitter files and why it's so important that Americans understand what they revealed, what they were, and why the media tried to minimize them in many instances. We're also going to be talking about the war in Israel, RFK Jr.'s big announcement and what's going on with his candidacy, and the race for Speaker of the House in the Republican Party. Let's roll the intro and get into the Twitter files. We're going to go a bit chronologically to understand the Twitter files. So if you haven't read my book, Red, White, and Blind, which came out earlier this year, a number of topics in the book do address censorship and social media, and specifically social media censorship of the news, and the role that plays in American media in terms of censorship, propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, etc., which are the primary topics of the book and of this show. So before anything to do with the Twitter files dropped, which happened at the end of 2022, at which point my book was already done and off to the publisher, even before that happened, we had a number of instances of censorship on social media. So first of all, there's the instance that I write about in chapter 1 of the book when the Biden laptop story was removed from the news. And I use that as the third example of censorship at the beginning of the book because I think it's a very clear-cut example. Essentially what we had is a laptop belonging to Hunter Biden turned up in a repair shop, and somebody was able to get into it and decipher some of the information on the laptop, including recovering a bunch of emails that Hunter Biden had sent and received. So what happened, this is just a few weeks before the 2020 election, what happened, because there was a sense that this could influence voters because it revealed, or it allegedly revealed, there was a lot of writing and discussion about it in the media, except for when it was censored, that it revealed heightened levels of corruption between the Biden family, and specifically Hunter Biden and his father, Joe Biden, with Ukraine and over the Burisma scandal in Ukraine. So what happened at the time is, as this story broke by the New York Post a few weeks before the election, it was immediately banned by Twitter. You couldn't even read it. You couldn't read the article. You couldn't share the article. It was very strange. And that's why I write about it in the book, in this section called A New Kind of Silence in Chapter 1. We can't complete this request. This link has been identified by Twitter as harmful. These are the words on a tweet on my feed in October of 2020. It was just weeks before the presidential election. So this was the New York Post article about Joe Biden's alleged involvement in the Ukrainian corruption scandal. But for some reason, the story was censored. So I wrote about that a bit in the book. Another thing that happened early on that I covered in the book is that during COVID, many people who dissented from the mainstream narratives about things like the origin of the virus, things like natural immunity, what the fatality rate was, the effectiveness of masks or of lockdowns, and then, of course, as the vaccines rolled out, it became even a more difficult media landscape to navigate, partly because social media and mainstream media was censoring one side of the debate on these issues. And something that I spent a lot of time talking about in Red, White, and Blind, although it's not a COVID-focused book. But it was a big deal. And so one of the things that happened was there was shadow banning. Shadow banning is when somebody is censored or their tweets or posts are dialed down, but they don't know about it. So, for example, if I'm shadow banned, which I seem to be often on Twitter, I'm not certain, but I used to have my tweets reach many more people, and then suddenly it starts to, you reach fewer and fewer people, and you're not exactly sure why. And so for a long time, Twitter said, oh no, we don't do shadow banning. We don't even know what that is. That's not something we'd ever do. 2018, if we just go back, they denied it on their blog. They denied that they'd ever done anything like shadow banning. And then just 2 years later in 2020, there was this hack when some people acquired access to Elon Musk's Twitter account, tweeted out this thing about he'd give away free Bitcoin, and they made off with a bunch of Bitcoin that people sent to this fake account. But what happened during the hack that was very interesting is the hackers revealed the tools they used inside of the Twitter administration. And sure enough, in there were these tags that could be placed on different users that would reduce the spread of them. They'd be like banned, their topics would be prevented from trending, or they themselves would be prevented from trending. So it was very clear that Twitter was doing this. So that's 2020. Also during COVID and in the year or two immediately after in 2021, we did notice many, many people being censored or being shadow banned on Twitter, such as Martin Kulldorff, one of the leading epidemiologists in the world at Harvard, when he would said anything that dissented even sort of insignificantly, but some small dissent from the mainstream narratives. Also, you had people like Jay Bhattacharya, a doctor at Stanford, scientists like Robert Malone, and then even people like Joe Rogan, who are independent media hosts, and many others like him found that their tweets and their posts were sometimes shadow banned. We had people in Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, whatever you think about her, it was quite fascinating, I think alarming, to see the level to which social media was shadow banning Marjorie Taylor Greene, a sitting member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, at about this time, Twitter had announced a new CEO. His name was Pradeep Agrawal. And one of the most interesting quotes he provided upon taking over as CEO is he said, one of the changes today that we see is that speech is easy on the internet. Most people can speak. Where our role is particularly emphasized is who can be heard. So who's coming out and saying part of our role might be to dial down the influence of certain people, which is essentially shadow banning to the extent. So the other important piece of this is, was this censorship and shadow banning a violation of free speech? And this is another thing that I take on in Red, White, and Blind because I think it's a fascinating topic to consider. Just to give the opposing arguments for a moment, people say things like, well, it's a private company, it's not the government. So if Twitter decides they don't want you to speak on their platform, that's they can do whatever they want. They're a private company. The other thing they say is, you can always just go somewhere else and you can just speak your mind somewhere else. So I make 3 points. Briefly, I'll go through them as to why this argument is not very well thought out and not very comprehensively considered. So first of all, social media is the new public square in our country, and that's been mentioned by the Supreme Court, and I think it's clear to anybody that's just living in the United States right now. It's not like you go down to the marketplace and literally take a soapbox, flip it over and stand on top of it, and now you're on your soapbox speaking. That's what a soapbox originally meant, but we don't do that anymore. That's not something that people do. There aren't big markets like that where it's free to just sort of speak your mind. So instead what people do is they go and speak their mind on social media, and that's where we go to connect. That's how we find each other. That's the new public square. The second point is that Twitter is not just any company. It's not like Joe's Pizza on the corner saying, I don't want you to talk about Trump, or I don't want you to talk about Biden while you're eating pizza here. That's fine. He can say that that's not a violation of your free speech. You can go get pizza somewhere else. But Twitter and Facebook and Google, these are monopolies. There is no alternative option, right? And some people will say, well, if you get banned on Twitter, you could go to Facebook. But then we saw that the government was actually interested in having people be banned across all of them at the same time and coordinated shadow banning. And a separate point that I get into in the book is that they're distinct products. Twitter is a distinct product from Facebook. Twitter has a monopoly over Twitter. It's not the same to go on Facebook. If you're really good at Twitter and you're really used to communicating with your audience on Twitter, you can't just go to Facebook and do the same thing, or to Google. They're separate, distinct monopolies of separate, distinct, indispensable services for people that want to communicate politically these days. So the first point is that social media is the new public square. The second is that they're monopolies. And the third is that there's so many interactions between government and these giant tech monopolies that interaction between them is inevitable. And they're always going to be, the government's going to want to reduce speech that opposes its views, and the big corporations are going to want to have either less regulation or the kind of regulation they want They really depend on Section 230 of the Online Media Decency Act. And so because of that, because of these three reasons, when a big tech monopoly like Google or Twitter censors you, it's a violation of your free speech. And we could get into it more. Maybe I'll make a whole separate video on that particular discussion. But what was interesting in my book is we didn't yet have clear evidence that this was going on, that Twitter was actually deliberately shadow banning and censoring people. It was fairly clear, and there were a lot of people with stories. But I suggest in the book it's definitely happening, but I didn't have actual definitive proof in the book. What I suggested and surmised, but didn't have proof for, was that the government was deliberately taking action. So this is why the Twitter files are so fascinating. So now we move forward. 2018, Twitter says, we don't do shadow banning, we don't know what that is. 2020, hacks come out and show that they do have shadow banning, they do have those tools. And then 2022, the Twitter files land. And it all begins with one fateful tweet from journalist Matt Taibbi on December 2nd, 2022. The Twitter files, it starts. What you're about to read is the first installment in a series based upon thousands of internal documents obtained by sources by Twitter. And what it revealed was crystal clear. Twitter had acted on behalf of the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and several other government agencies, directly to censor ideas that were inimical to government narratives, at the direct request of those government agencies. This is the very essence of the First Amendment. The whole reason to have a First Amendment, to protect free speech, is that government cannot come through and tell people that they can't say things that the government doesn't want them to say. There are a few tiny exceptions. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater, right? You can't directly incite imminent violence, and you can't directly slander or libel someone. There's a few small exceptions, but basically there is no way to argue anything other than a violation of the Constitution when social media companies such as Twitter directly talk to government agencies on a weekly basis. Sometimes it was even more frequent, the Twitter files revealed. More frequent than weekly. Sometimes within hours. We need this guy taken down. We need that article reduced. How come you haven't done this yet? These are the kinds of communication that were happening between Twitter executives and people in the government. So that is why the essence of what the Twitter files revealed is so important to understand. That social media is directly in violation, Twitter at least, and we'll get to Facebook and Google later, but Twitter was in direct violation of the Constitution doing this. We also learned that the government can read everything, even your direct messaging, prompting some to say the whole site could be a honeypot. If you know what a honeypot is a technical device. It can also be a place or a person, but in the idea of computer programming, it's something that tempts hackers or tempts dissidents to come in and use it in order, because it's being carefully surveilled by the regulators, or being carefully surveilled by the government, will actually lure the dissidents or the criminals in. That's what a honeypot is. That seems a bit extreme for Twitter, but it's certainly something to think about. What's also really disturbing about this story is that when Matt Taibbi, who along with several other journalists was given these documents by Elon Musk, there were 5 or 6 different journalists, and I'll mention them in a minute, Matt Taibbi was called to Congress to testify about this. And he was grilled, particularly by people on the Democratic side, which for some reason Democrats seem much more interested or much more in support of this type of censorship, which I find baffling and disturbing. But so it was Democrats who were really grilling Matt Taibbi about this. And at the same time that he was being grilled in Congress, the IRS knocked on his door when he was gone and basically initiated a search of his house, which certainly looks like intimidation. And in an interview, Matt Taibbi said he didn't have anything unusual in his taxes that year. There were no special outstanding bills or anything. There's even if there were, there's no reason for the IRS to come and knock on your door and search your house. I mean, that's disturbing, let's just say. So in summary, the reason the Twitter files are so important is because they reveal something that I and many others assumed was probably happening, showed lots of evidence that it could be happening, but now shows it beyond a shadow of a doubt. that Twitter was censoring journalists, censoring doctors, censoring scientists, anyone speaking out against the mainstream narratives about anything to do with COVID, about the Ukraine war, about any of these types of things where dissent is essential. I talk about in Red, White, and Blind why we need dissent in both science and democracy. You can't really have either science or democracy or any other of the bedrock principles that we've depended on since the Enlightenment for what we call Western civilization. You can't have these ideas if you don't allow dissent. If what you have is just one set of beliefs that is allowed, that's what we had before the Enlightenment. That's feudalism. That's the Catholic Church. That's the Earth is the center of the galaxy. Anybody that says anything different will be burned at the stake or will be put on the rack. If you dissent, you're a blasphemer or a witch, and it's our way or the highway. That is a tremendous move backwards, right? The only reason that we have democracy is because we need to acknowledge that there are multiple ideas. And on something as huge as a war or a mandate for a medical procedure or a lockdown of schools, there have to be different sides allowed to discuss this. It's similar for science. Science can go nowhere if there's just one answer on something like that. If there's something like controversial like the vaccines or climate change, but even more, normal, like sort of everyday things like a drug being approved. If you can only have one particular view and any other view can be censored or suppressed or shadow banned on social media, science will go nowhere. You will just have complete capture of what is called science, and it won't be science anymore. It'll be religion. That's religion, right? Where there's only one answer is allowed. So the Twitter files revealed massive collaboration between the government and the social media corporations, in this case Twitter, to shadow ban, censor, and suppress ideas and viewpoints that ran counter to what the FBI and Department of Homeland Security and CDC and other agencies wanted to be discussed. Now, as I've mentioned many times before, the solution to this is always to balance your media diet. And it's something I've written quite a bit about. A whole chapter of Red, White, and Blind is on this. And I'm just in the process of launching a new website called balancedmediadiet.com, which is going to help people to the extent that I'm able and others that are collaborating with me to help others to balance their media diet. It's something that I do. And in preparation for every episode of this show, I read a diversity of sources, not just left and right, but top and bottom, sources that come from foreign news, corporate media on both the political Democrat and Republican side, but also news sources that go below the parties and beyond that in political analysis, all different types of sources, and it's really important. That's why the Balanced Media Diet exists. All right, well, that's all I have today about the Twitter files. We're going to be talking about a few other topics here. If you like this video, if you like this kind of discussion, please share and like this video. Please subscribe to the channel. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm and with the Rumble algorithm that we're building a channel on Rumble as well because, we just talked about social media censorship. This channel could certainly be censored or shadow banned if it isn't already. So thank you so much for watching. My name's Tony Bersunas. This has been Red, White, and Blind. One other thing we're going to cover today is the candidacy of RFK Jr., which is a fascinating development, particularly for people of the independent political persuasion, such as yours truly here at Red, White, and Blind. All right, so let's take a look at RFK Jr. and his candidacy. So he began running as a Democrat. His family, of course, his father was RFK Sr., who nearly became president before he was assassinated in California in 1968. His uncle did become president, JFK, John F. Kennedy, who was murdered assassinated in 1963. And Bobby Kennedy Jr. is now running. He is a fascinating candidate, I find. He was an environmental lawyer for most of his life. After struggling through several addictions early on in his life, he became a leading environmental lawyer. And then recently he's been, opposed to vaccine mandates and sort of made his name most recently on that particular topic. But he's fought his whole life, I would say, to prevent corporate capture of regulatory agencies. So corporate capture is when, like, the CDC, for instance, gets captured by Big Pharma, and so their ability to regulate, or the FDA, I should say, gets captured by Big Pharma, so their ability to regulate drugs is compromised. or the EPA gets captured by fossil fuel or some other industry that wants to damage the environment, and then they're unable to regulate that. So anyway, so RFK was running as a Democrat, but he ran into several issues there, such as the fact that, first of all, the Biden administration will not provide him Secret Service protection, which I think is particularly stunning and disturbing given the history of his family. But then also they made a number of rules in the primary that were going to make it very difficult for him and also Marianne Williamson and any other Democrats running to mount a serious campaign for the nomination. And even when it was wide open, as we saw in 2016 with Bernie Sanders, it was extremely difficult, and the DNC and the Democratic Party threw so many roadblocks in the way of Bernie Sanders and his supporters, as I cover in depth in Red, White, and Blind, including what we learned from the WikiLeaks when the emails came out, showing the extent to which they were rigging the primary against Bernie Sanders. And we saw that again in 2020 when Biden won the nomination over Bernie Sanders with things like the Shadow app and how that was able to change the outcome in the Iowa caucus at the beginning of that campaign. So RFK has made the momentous and historic decision to run as an independent. That was the big announcement he made a couple weeks ago in Philadelphia, just across from the Independence Hall there. And he says, "Declare your own independence." I think it's a catchy ad, and here's the first commercial that he ran, and I think it's worth taking a quick look at that.
House Republicans continue to fight. The left is a cult.
I don't want to hear it from Republicans. We'll beat the out of them.
Time out.
I need you to report helping your party. Anarchy across America. Radical Democrats. Republicans. Republicans.
Yeah, I was fed up too. And that's why I'm running for President of the United States as an independent. I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I approve this message.
So I think it's an interesting message that I think will resonate with a lot of political independents who are kind of fed up. In fact, Red, White, and Blind, part of the reason that the book has found success, to the extent I've been able to find success with the book, it's because people really do feel that the media is deceiving them and that it's no longer has their best interests at heart, and they're not sure why. And so Red, White, and Blind, we really go into why that is and why it's quite clear that, yes, the corporate media does not have your best interests in heart. They're not trying to tell you true stories about what's going on in the world. They're trying to get you to believe stories that aid their own control of the narrative so that they can tell you what's going on in the world. We'll get into that more in other segments, but the other thing that's very interesting that I found with RFK Jr. is that in addition to his uniting message and I think the power of an independent run, he's continued to find difficulty receiving any kind of coverage other than really negative pieces in the mainstream media. And so for that reason, here on Red, White, and Blind, we will occasionally discuss RFK Jr. because it's almost impossible to find in the corporate media articles that are giving him a fair shake. Just one quick example is the situation that's happened with him. As I mentioned a minute ago, he's not given Secret Service protection, which all other candidates have always been. Any other candidate for the last 55 years since those assassinations has been given Secret Service protection when they've requested it. RFK Jr. has requested it numerous times from the Biden administration and not been given that protection. And now what we've seen just in the last week or two, we've seen a number of scenarios in which strange people have gotten very close to RFK. There was a situation in California not even very far from where his own father was assassinated in 1968, but a man dressed in sort of this like costume of a U.S. Marshal with like some badges and guns, making him look like an official person, was able to sort of sneak into this place RFK was doing an event and get very close before his own personal private security was able to identify and isolate him and eventually have the police come in and take him away. But then when LA law enforcement, looked at the case, they basically released the guy on bail and said, oh, he might have some mental issues. And then just now, another intruder has been able to get into RFK's house twice on the same day. He got in and they took him they arrested him, and then the police released him, and then he went back and they arrested him again. So it's a really interesting story, and I find it disturbing, and it's not being covered in the media, so I find it something worth contemplating why the Biden administration would not be providing Secret Service to RFK Jr. It's not like he's a minor candidate. At this point in polls, he's receiving somewhere between 15 and 30% of the vote, and this is with essentially no media coverage if he's in a head-to-head with Biden and Trump. Okay, well that's it. That's the story of RFK Jr. And if you enjoy and like this type of content, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm Tony Bersunas. You can find all of this at tonybersunas.com or at my Substack, which is redwhiteandblind.substack.com. All right, so let's take a look at the GOP race to elect the new Speaker of the House of Representatives. Now, as you know from Red, White, and Blind, this is strictly an independent channel. I'm neither a Republican nor a Democrat, and there's plenty of evidence and tremendous problems with censorship and propaganda and media bias and manipulation on both sides of the political aisle. In fact, part of the reason that I wrote Red, White, and Blind was to point out that we are all in this state called Red, White, and Blind because of the corporate media and all of the distortion in the media deceiving us and preventing us from understanding what's really going on in our lives and in the world. But sometimes it's important to focus on what's happening in one party or the other. We spent quite a bit of time looking at the Democratic Party around the Bernie Sanders issues, and we will again. But for the GOP and the Republican Party right now, it's fascinating to watch what's happening for the House, for the Speaker of the House contest. If you're not aware what the Speaker of the House is, it's arguably the second or third most powerful position in the U.S. government. The Speaker of the House of Representatives is the leader of the lower house of Congress, gets to basically set the agenda, has all kinds of powers in basically adjudicating what laws come up for debate, what things can get discussed, what kinds of amendments can be proposed, and when and how. Tremendous amount of power, and you're also the leader of the majority party in the House. So this has never happened before. We've never had a situation where the party in power basically vacated or expressed no confidence in their speaker. This had never happened before in the 250-year history of our country, nearing 250 years. So what happened was Matt Gaetz, who was a Republican, and Kevin McCarthy, who was the Republican Speaker of the House, had some disputes about things. Matt Gaetz is in what's called the Freedom Caucus, which in the blue news and sort of the mainstream Democrat media, they're called right-wingers or hardliners or extreme conservatives. What they are is they're called the Freedom Caucus, and they basically oppose the mainstream of the Republican Party quite a bit and are more libertarian. They're less interested in going into wars in places like Ukraine. They're more opposed to things like the vaccine mandates and abortion. There's a number of things we could get into without getting into all of it right now. But the point is there's a break there. And to be honest, it was a break I thought we were going to see in the Democratic Party after 2016. I thought when we had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Squad and a number of these progressive Democrats come in, that there'd be a real power struggle and that you'd see the progressives, that branch of the Democratic Party, really exercising its power to push for things like Medicare for all, $15 minimum wage, some of these things that the Bernie Sanders movement really championed. But we haven't seen that at all in the Democratic Party. Really, even AOC herself recently said that the Democratic Party now runs in Congress like a well-oiled machine. Which isn't something you would expect from somebody who came into office promising to, protest at every turn, to make some noise, to slow down the process, all of this stuff. Instead, we've seen the Democratic Party be really like lockstep on just about everything for the past 5 years. So instead, what we're seeing real dissent on the Republican side of the aisle. And it's interesting, I think, rather than allow who Matt Gaetz is and what his issues were with Kevin McCarthy to be sort of manipulated by the media, you should just listen to him himself. So I'll play a little bit of his remarks. Basically what he's saying is he wants reforms. And a lot of these reforms in the House are things that are nonpartisan, things that almost everybody agrees would be better for the rules of the House. But right now, the Speaker of the House rules with more or less complete power over how the process goes. Another big issue is that they'll do these giant budget bills where everything gets rolled into one and it's sort of thrown at the rest of the House at the last minute where they have to vote up or down. And it'll be like, fund the Ukraine war with billions of dollars, but also fund this like health clinic in your district. And then dozens and dozens of other things, and you're given a couple days or less to read about it. And so basically it's almost like they're at gunpoint. You either have to vote for the whole thing or nothing. And what the Republicans and the Freedom Caucus were saying, and I think we've heard this from many people all across the political aisle before, is that this is not a fair or reasonable or efficient or effective way to do government. There should be a separate up and down spending bills should be voted on individually. If we want to support Ukraine in this proxy war with Russia, that should be one vote. If we want to go and expand an Air Force base in Kansas or California, then that should be a separate vote. Occasionally you can bundle things together that are really closely related, but instead of this notion of an omnibus bill, which means like everything gets thrown in the last minute or the government's going to shut down, that's a real problem. So let's listen to Matt Gaetz.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized with 3 minutes remaining. To be clear, I tried to get one of the three podiums on the Republican side, and y'all wouldn't let me have them, so you sent me over here. But you know what? I'll make this argument at any desk in this building, from the well, from the chair. I'll make it on every street corner in this country that Washington must change. We have to break the cycle. We have to break the fever. And I would hope, truly, that the reforms that we are fighting for are reforms that would last and be embraced and that would democratize power in this institution beyond the privileged few who back us up against shutdown politics and Christmases and deadlines in order to achieve their objectives. Mr. Speaker, high inflation is on the verge of bankrupting American families. Our economy is breaking in half. A typical American family can't afford to buy a house in 99% of U.S. counties. Inflation is stealing more than $700 a month from working Americans, nearly $9,000 a year. Kevin McCarthy is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he has failed to take a stand where it matters. So if he won't, I will. I make no apologies for defending the right of every hardworking American to afford a decent life for themselves and their families, and we have a greater opportunity to do that and to build coalitions under new leadership. We have to rip off the Band-Aid. We have to get back on a better course. And Mr. Speaker, I don't know how this vote's going to go. Usually when a vote comes to this floor, it's pretty predetermined. And this one, I'm not so sure. But I am sure that we've made the right argument, that this place deserves single-subject spending bills, that we should have 72 hours to read a bill, that something that spends more than $100 million shouldn't be put on the suspension agenda such that we can't amend it, and there shouldn't be secret side deals made on a continuing resolution to lump Ukraine in with border security. That is not right for Ukraine or border security, because it fails to give either of those issues the dignity that they would require. But we can return that dignity to this House. We can get back on a better path. We can have single subject appropriations bills. We can set a budget top line. We haven't had a budget in this place since I was in high school. So let's get a budget. Let's get our act together. Let's get on with it. Let's vacate the chair, and let's get a better speaker. I yield back.
So I think, as you can hear, I mean, to my ear, he's not saying anything that's like wild, crazy, right-wing hardliner. He's basically calling for reforms. Now, what happened is, and right today as I'm making this video, we just had Mike Johnson was elected. So I was going to make this video and sort of end it on, we still don't know who's going to be the Speaker of the House, but actually we do. But it took a number of rounds. And so it was really fascinating to see, I found, not a Republican myself, but to see that there was some level, it seems, of actual democracy happening there. Like in parliamentary systems in other parts of the world, you have these real sort of like convoluted alliance making between, usually a parliamentary system, there'll be many parties in the parliament. Obviously, usually there'll be two that are really dominant, but there'll be a number of other ones and they have to compose a government. But you saw that the Freedom Caucus and then the sort of mainline Republicans really had some real differences, and they had a difficult time coming together. So I think if you cut through the media bias, which is always important here at Red, White, and Blind, we always talk about balancing our media diet in order to understand these things from multiple perspectives. If you just listen to NPR, read the New York Times about this, you'll think a certain thing about Republicans and the Freedom Caucus. And of course, if you just listen to Red News and you just listen to Fox or talk radio, or we could say Tucker Carlson, although he's gone off on his own independent path at this point, you would also get a real biased view of what the Freedom Caucus is all about. So we'll just continue to look at this. I thought, we would be seeing this on the left. Instead, we're seeing this on the right, this real difference among the party. And so we'll see, as Mike Johnson takes over the House, how that affects things going forward. All right, so let's get into Israel. This very, very touchy and difficult, horrible situation, really, is the only way to describe it. Very, very difficult, very complex situation. But I don't think it's so complicated that we can't discuss it. And from the standpoint of Red, White, and Blind, where the purpose of this channel is to break through the spells and the deception, the lies in the corporate media and discern the story behind the story, I think it really is worthwhile taking a quick look. Now, I'm not an expert in the Israel situation. In terms of my ethnicity, I have one Jewish side of my family, one side is not Jewish, and I could get into that further, but I won't. I think I see both sides of it, at least with some clarity. I don't think I'm completely emotionally tied to one side. And I wanted to offer my thoughts about this because I think it's so dominant in the media right now. To start, a lot of times people will go into the history and try to establish, Palestine was here first, or Israel was here first, or what the history was. And there are maps from 1947 that show Palestine right there. And then there's others on the more Israeli side who say that those Arabs were just colonists from Saudi Arabia. There's so much convoluted history to this. It really is a chicken and the egg. It's like, where do you start? Do you start your history at this point, or this point, or this point, or this point? And I do think it's important to understand the history to get a real true handle on any complex or even not very complex situation, to know the history. But in this particular case, I think the history actually maybe is being overplayed. It's been tied in knots so many times, I think it's impossible to untie at this point. And so rather than discuss the history, I think we just discuss the present. The present we can have a clearer view at. And I think if we look at the present situation on the ground, what we have is a Israeli government that is clearly dominant over the land of Gaza and the West Bank. They're able to control what people in Gaza are able to order, what comes in and what goes out of Gaza completely. So whether that's water and food and medical supplies, or that's technology. And I think it's worthwhile to think about how that would be to live in a place where by your ethnicity or by your religion, you are identified as a group that has less power than a dominant group. And that's when you have to look at the present, forget the past, and compare it to things where we've seen that happen in the past. Places like North America with the Native Americans, or China with the Tibetans, where I spent some time, or South Africa, right, where they call this apartheid. And I think it's a reasonable description of what's going on in Israel is apartheid. And when you have a situation like this, you're inevitably going to have what are called terrorist attacks. And the attacks are horrendous that's happened. The loss of life on both sides is horrendous. And most of the world fully supports the right of Israelis to punish criminals, to enforce their laws, to prevent acts of terrorism like this. But if you maintain an apartheid state, if you maintain this such a huge imbalance of power, and you raise people, like there are people now that have lived 20 years in Gaza, children born there, that have never been able to have control over their own life, have never been able to come and go as they please, never been able to, have running water all the time, like these kinds of things that are available just across the border. And so I think if you continue this way, you're going to inevitably have these kinds of attacks, unfortunately. So I do believe that a two-state solution is what's necessary at this point. I think it's the only thing that can be humane or sustainable. And if we do witness Israel invade Gaza and kill or remove 2 million people from that area, we will have to call it ethnic cleansing or genocide, whatever however you define those words. I don't think there's any other way to talk about this. And it's really been fascinating but horrifying to hear in the mainstream media, particularly on the red side, the red news, with Fox and some of the people on the talk radio on that side, basically calling for, the final, I don't think they use the word the final solution, but it's like, finish them. That was what it was. Finish the job. What does that mean, to finish the job? I think these words by Scott Ritter that appear on the Jimmy Dore show are instructive.
This is a conflict that cannot end until one side or the other has been decisively beaten and is willing to make the kind of compromises that they're not willing to make now. And frankly speaking, given the level of suffering that the Palestinian people have undergone over the past 7 decades, they're not likely to be the side that breaks first. Israel is a fundamentally broken nation morally. It's a nation that, regardless of what you think, I know some people take umbrage at this, but I happen to be somebody who believes that Israel has the right to exist, and that we should respect Israel's right to exist, but not in the way that it exists today. You can't exist on the backs of people that you've enslaved, and they have enslaved the Palestinians. In fact, it's worse than slavery, because slaves at least get to have the pretense of working in the fields, pretending for a moment maybe they're free. The Palestinians, especially those in Gaza, are stuck in this open-air prison, not of their own construct. Israel underwent a fundamental change in its demographics and politics in the 1990s when they opened the doors to the former Soviet Union, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews fled to Israel, altering the balance. So when I was in Israel in the 1990s, there was a struggle between right and left, but both agreed that there was a necessity for peace. However imperfect their political solutions might have been, I know for a fact that Yitzhak Rabin was looking for a peaceful outcome, looking for a settlement before he was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli. And now Benjamin Netanyahu has stepped into the gap, and ever since then, Israel has been drifting towards an even more radical right-wing solution. As long as Benjamin Netanyahu and his ilk are in power in Israel, there is no hope for peace, none whatsoever. And you are right. Israel will go into Gaza with a vengeance, and hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians will lose their lives.
Another thing that hasn't been covered in the mainstream media is the fact that Israel appears to have been warned about the attack before it happened. I'd like to leave you with this message from Amber Yang of Peers, which is an organization that does media activism on their own and that I support. These are her words. The geopolitical turmoil in Israel and Gaza has appropriately captured our collective attention. Wherever you stand on this important issue, it can be exhausting and heartbreaking to make sense of this deeply complex issue. The culture and information wars playing out in the media have generated ferocious argument, yet very little clarity about how we can engage with each other across the vast differences in the information we consume. At Peers, we question any narrative that justifies war or keeps us divided into us versus them camps. There is unspeakable suffering and innocent people dying on both sides. Acknowledging the basic humanity at stake is not affiliated with a side nor dependent on an enemy to destroy. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Through violence you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence you murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. Along the way of life, someone must have enough sense and morality to cut off the chain of hate. Martin Luther King. This is especially important when we debate and discuss shared versions of reality and history about this complex conflict. How would we relate to this issue if the goal wasn't to have clear answers or to determine who is in the right or wrong? India's first and longest-serving Prime Minister, Nehru, once said, "Let us be a little humble. Let us think that the truth may not be entirely with us, And I'll leave it there. My prayers are with the children and the civilians on both sides, and I do hope that all of us can resolve to balance our media diets to get a broader set of perspectives so that we can, in the words of Amber Yang, question any narrative that justifies war or keeps us divided into us versus them camps. Wherever you stand on this very complex and difficult situation, I hope that you will balance your media diet, listen to others, address perspectives that are not your own. For we all have to, at some point, in the words of Martin Luther King, be those who have enough sense and morality to cut off the chain of hate. Thank you. This is Tony Bersunas. This is Red, White, and Blind. If you like and enjoy this content, please feel free to share and subscribe. Best wishes.